Thank you for joining the Office of School and Community Nutrition Programs Wellness Policy webinar series. This webinar is the second in a series of 4 on implementing the 2016 USDA Wellness Policy Final Rule. Let's go over a few housekeeping items before we get started. As I said in the previous slide, this is the second of 4 wellness policy webinars designed to help your agency meet the new wellness policy requirements and ultimately improve student access to physical activity and nutritious messaging and foods. These requirements were released in July of 2016 with an implementation date of June 30th, 2017. Webinars are chunked into 15-minute increments to help you meet your professional standards goals. Use Professional Standards Code 3230 under the Healthy School Environment Standard. This webinar will be broken into 2 15-minute sections for a total of 30 minutes of content with time built in for stopping to apply the information presented. Also, these videos are aligned with the Maryland system level recommendations for wellness policy implementation, which will be identified throughout the series. Lastly, these webinars were designed with you in mind. We know you wear many hats and sometimes have limited time. Please go at your own pace, feel free to stop and start the video at any time, and explore the accompanying resources when it is most convenient for you. Time is built into each webinar to allow you to explore those resources when it will be most helpful. Having a pen and paper handy for notes throughout will also be helpful. It's time to talk about writing your wellness policy. Let's go! The objective of this second video is to give you the tools to create a wellness policy that improves the nutrition and physical activity environment, can be measured and implemented, and meets all requirements. You'll notice I listed compliance last. We really want this policy to be something that is unique to your agency, a document that drives your efforts to create a healthier school environment for students. Throughout the video, I will remind you to think about your agency and how our recommendations can be tailored to your unique needs. Maryland created 10 evidence-based recommendations for agencies to lead to the successful implementation of wellness policies. The recommendations focus on building wellness policy teams, communicating wellness policy information, and monitoring wellness policy implementation. The recommendations are focused on implementation of the written wellness policy, so there's not a recommendation that overtly says, write a policy, which is really the focus of this webinar. However, there are a few recommendations that are key to consider during the writing phase. Recommendation 3 indicates that wellness policy implementation and monitoring plans should be considered while developing your policy. How will your agency communicate the policy and the plans to students, families, or the community? Some agencies build these items into their policy and others create supplemental documentation. Your agency will need to consider these options during the policy writing stage. Since the USDA now requires that each agency conduct a triennial assessment, your policy should be written with measurement in mind. This will be a new challenge for many agencies. The policy can no longer be a document that you cross off your list. Instead, you must write your policy and measure its implementation. Think now, how will your agency measure the progress made in attaining the goals of your wellness policy? What will you need to change, or what would need to be done differently in order for your wellness policy to become a document that regularly guides decisions made about the school nutrition and physical activity environment? We know that what gets measured gets done. Pause now to consider how will you measure the implementation of the policy you are about to write. So let's start talking about the details of what needs to be written in your wellness policy. I brought Stu Idell in today because he's been around since wellness policies first started in 2006. He's going to tell us about the original requirements that you've been following for the last 10 years.
Well, thanks, Leah. That's correct. There were 4 original ones, and that was you had to have written goals for physical activity, nutrition education, other goals that impacted child health in the school, and of course, nutrition standards for all foods that were in the school environment. And I have been around for a while, and there were just 4. Now there's more, right?
Yes, there are more, and we're going to discuss them throughout the next couple of minutes. To recap, when wellness policies were first introduced in 2006, they required specific goals for nutrition education, physical activity, and other school-based activities that promote wellness. They also required nutrition information for all foods available on the school campus during the school day. The new rule adds requirements for nutrition promotion goals. It also further specifies nutrition guidelines needed for all foods available on the school campus during the school day. It requires policies for food and beverage marketing restrictions, and a written description of the following items: how your agency involves and informs the public, designation of the person or position who is responsible for policy implementation, and a description of the agency's plan for evaluation. In the next several minutes, we will outline those items in more detail. Let's take a look first at specific goals. These requirements should already be in your wellness policy, with the exception of nutrition promotion. USDA wants you to consider evidence-based goals that are also measurable. Evidence-based nutrition promotion strategies that you could consider including in your wellness policy can be found on the Smarter Lunchrooms website, included with our resources for this video. An example of a Smarter Lunchroom strategy would be conducting a fruit or vegetable taste test or allowing students to participate in menu selection. Already doing these things? Write them down in your policy to ensure they become a sustainable part of your school's nutrition environment. What seems to be the hardest part for agencies is making these goals measurable. Let's talk for a few minutes about creating measurable goals for your wellness policy. Here with us today is Chris Herschel, Physical Education Specialist here at the Maryland State Department of Education. He's going to talk a little bit about how you can include measurable goals for physical activity into your wellness policy.
Our goal in wellness policies is to get kids as active as possible. So to meet recommendations, our goal is to have 60 minutes of physical activity as a minimum for all students. That physical activity can be accomplished through physical education, recess, before and after school programming, and in the community. To make it measurable in your policy, though, you'll want to have specific goals about how students will meet those 60 minutes. For example, you could say that students will receive 30 minutes of physical education daily and 20 minutes of recess daily, plus 10 minutes in a recreational program. Or you might decide that as a group, you'll incorporate movement into instruction and make a policy that each classroom will have 15 minutes of physical activity as part of their instructional process during the day. Regardless of the combination that you choose, you want to make sure that you're reaching at least 60 minutes for every child in your setting.
Thanks, Chris. And as Chris said, 60 minutes is the recommended amount of physical activity for each student every day. It's not required by your wellness policy, but it is an effective practice that we recommend. Your wellness policy also needs to include nutrition guidelines for all foods and beverages sold. This is referencing the Maryland Nutrition Standards for all foods sold in school. If you're wondering what you need to write in your policy to meet this requirement, you can use that first paragraph on this screen stating that all foods and beverages sold in school during the school day must follow the Maryland Nutrition Standards for all foods sold in school, which incorporates the federal Smart Snacks standards. These standards include foods sold in vending machines, fundraisers, and school stores. The Maryland Nutrition Standards for all foods sold in school should be referenced in your policy and easily accessible to those reading your policy and trying to implement it. This resource is included with the other resources in this video. Here to talk a little bit more about nutrition standards is Sarah Booker, one of our registered dietitians in the Office of School and Community Nutrition Programs. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Leah.
Sarah, one of the questions we get a lot is, how are the Maryland Nutrition Standards different than the federal Smart Snacks in School standards?
That's a great question because there's a lot of resources out there that are geared at the national level of the regulations, and there are just a couple of differences here in Maryland. The differences primarily are things that were part of our previous standards here in Maryland that we decided to carry through and not relax to the point where the Smart Snacks came in. And those are specific to beverages, really. So we have one criteria that makes sure that we don't have any caffeinated products being sold to students. Because of some potential for negative health outcomes, they are going to be looking more at research in that. We'll stay tuned for any updates, but right now the recommendation is for children and adolescents to avoid caffeine. So we figured keeping that in place was a smart idea. So caffeine is now restricted across all age groups except where it's just naturally occurring, like in chocolate milk. And the other piece that is restricted, again, from our previous set of standards, is that no soda would be sold to students. So even if it is low-calorie soda, like diet soda, that still wouldn't be allowable during the applicable times of the Smart Snacks rule.
Oh. So Sarah, how does the USDA define the school day and when these standards apply or do not apply?
That's a great question because it doesn't exactly flow with everybody's logic here. So they define the school day as starting as 1 minute after midnight through 30 minutes after the end of the instructional day. So that means that a half hour after your instructional day ends, you're not obligated to follow the rules unless your agency decides to go above and beyond. So you have from 30 minutes after through midnight where the rule technically doesn't apply.
Great. Okay, that's very helpful. So Sarah, do the Maryland Nutrition Standards apply to residential or after-school programs?
Well, let's see. There is a specific definition for time that we just went over, and there's also a specific definition for where the rule is applicable, and they define that as the school campus. So anywhere that instruction is happening and is technically part of the school grounds that students have access to, usually residential areas like cottages and homes where students are spending the night, those typically are not considered part of the school campus in terms of this rule. So that means, again, usually they're there outside of the school day. So again, you have that time and location, both meaning that's usually not an applicable place. After school programs can decide if they happen to be within that 30 minutes after the instructional day, if that's when they're starting, then technically they shouldn't have anything outside the rule until after that 30 minutes goes by. But as a rule, it really still is about that time frame we talked about.
Okay, great. And so are there any agencies or schools that you know of that are applying these Maryland Nutrition Standards, not just for foods sold in schools, but also for foods provided? For example, with a party or celebration, or foods provided by the teacher, not something that's being sold, but just foods given.
I have heard some agencies interested in expanding how they apply the rule, and really that is a best practice. I mean, the rules are important to help make sure healthier foods are provided and kind of prioritized. But really what you have is most agencies are not making it a hard rule, but they are encouraging any parties or any incentives that teachers or houses might give for good behavior or incentivizing participation in programs. programs, that would comply with the rules. And a lot of times I see teachers or groups that want to provide food, sometimes asking the food service team, hey, what are you providing? Because there's a better chance that that will meet the criteria.
Great, great. And so there are some like snacks and kind of fun foods available for students that do meet these standards. Is that correct?
That is correct. There is a resource on the Alliance for Healthier Generations website that allows you, there's two tools that we refer people to. One is a snack calculator, and that you can actually sit with a product label in front of you and enter some information. It guides you through what questions you need to answer, and that can tell you whether a product is compliant or not. There's also something they call a product navigator, and they have kind of a growing database of products that they've already checked to make sure that they approve. So you can kind of look by category, and it helps give some heads up about what things could be included. One caveat I usually give is that sometimes products that you might find through a distributor that specializes in school programs may offer a different formulation. So Doritos that you get through a K-12 provider is not the same kind of Doritos that you can buy at Costco or at a regular grocery store. So just be careful of that, because a lot of times it's the fat and the sodium content that differs, and that's a key piece of the Smart Snacks and the Maryland Nutrition Standards.
Great, great. Thank you so much, Sarah. This has been very helpful.
Great. Good luck, everybody.
We've just dug pretty deep into standards for all foods and beverages sold. Now let's take a look at standards for foods and beverages provided. There are no set standards that you must follow for foods and beverages provided to students. As long as you're not selling them, there is a lot of freedom for them to meet whatever standards you decide. The USDA does require that your agency create standards for those foods that your students may get on the school campus during the school day that are provided to them. We would certainly recommend that your agency follow the same standards for foods provided as foods sold, because we know that's maximizing the nutritional quality of the foods that students have access to. However, what's even more important than that is that the standards that you create for foods provided are actually followed and implemented in your agency. Foods may be provided at classroom parties, snacks brought by parents or community for sharing, or other foods given as incentives or rewards. Each educational agency must define their own standards. Those standards must be written into the wellness policy. Don't forget, think about how you will measure if those standards are consistently implemented. Pause now to consider what standards would be appropriate for your agency, and how would you measure if those standards are being implemented. Here is some sample language agencies have used to identify those standards for foods and beverages provided. The first one states celebrations and parties. The district or agency will provide a list of healthy party ideas to parents and teachers, including non-food celebration ideas. The second one states rewards and incentives. The district will provide teachers and other relevant school staff a list of alternative ways to reward children. Foods and beverages will not be used as reward or withheld as punishment for any reason, such as performance or behavior. As you can see, those standards for foods provided are very different. It is important that you choose standards for foods provided that will help your agency take a step forward in the nutrition environment provided for students. Choose standards that are realistic and best meet the needs of all stakeholders in your agency. So let's talk about food and beverage marketing. The new wellness policy final rule says that if you can't sell it, you can't market it. And we know that those standards for food sold in schools are those Maryland nutrition standards for all foods sold in schools. Your policy needs to say that any food and/or beverage marketed or advertised to students on the school campus during the school day will meet those standards. Large costly equipment, such as marquees or message boards, maybe menu boards in your cafeteria, don't require immediate replacement. But as you renew contracts and equipment is replaced, new equipment will need to comply with this rule. The rule will apply to food and beverage products, not necessarily logos or brand names. So for example, a Chick-fil-A cow that says "Eat More Chicken" will not be an issue because it is not advertising a specific food or menu item. However, giving students a coupon for a free Chick-fil-A milkshake, which most certainly does not meet the Maryland nutrition standards for all food sold in schools, would be a compliance problem. Lastly, the rule doesn't apply to things like personal items, clothing, staff belongings, or anything that serves an educational purpose. The final rule requires that agencies conduct an assessment of the policy at a minimum every 3 years. That assessment needs to be considered when writing the policy so that it aligns with the policy and implementation. We assess because it improves teaching and learning. The same thing applies here. So let's talk about an example. If you plan to eliminate food given as a reward or incentive, you would want to first identify some baseline data. Then write strong policy language restricting food as a reward into your policy. Write some sort of implementation plan for increasing awareness of the policy and to increase compliance. And then assess your agency's progress towards meeting that goal yearly, so that when it's time for your triennial report, it can be noted that you reduce the amount of food rewards or incentives by 25% over the course of 3 years. How you plan to accomplish this assessment should be written into your wellness policy. In webinar number 1, we talked about involving the public and updating them. A description of public involvement and public updates and the evaluation plan that we just discussed will all need to be written in your policy. Let's revisit some of those people we discussed in webinar 1 who might be able to help you in writing and implementing your wellness policy. The new rule requires an increase in participation with all sorts of different stakeholder groups. Sometimes it can be really intimidating to think, who might that be? Stu Idell's here to talk a little bit more about who that might be for your community.
Well, you're right. The new rule requires us to reach out and communicate with the community, and sometimes being the type of organization we are with a residential child care institution or a nonprofit private, we think we're our own little community, so it's difficult to identify who those folks might be. We've talked to a lot of those folks around the state, and we've heard some pretty good answers directly from them. And they say the best thing to do is just to reach out to someone we already know in the community that may not even be associated with our organization. Now, I think it's critical to think about not just your small group of the community, but to think about the larger community around you. I've heard some great stories. For example, you might reach out to an accrediting organization in the academic side of your organization. You might not think that that's a good group, but they are focused on the academic side, but they might also have some interest in identifying some of the health components. Maybe it's the accreditation side that's focused on nursing in your organization, the healthcare side. Maybe it's a local hospital that has said, well, wait, we've already got folks in our organization that are really interested in child nutrition. Maybe they can provide you with some expertise or support in what you're already trying to do with the child nutrition program. A really great idea I've heard before is to simply reach out to the employees who are working for you. They might have spouses or relatives or great connections already that have an interest or an expertise in the nutrition side. They might be a caterer, or maybe they're a dietitian who are of an interest in this, and they might take an interest in being either a part of an advisory board that you might have, or even just reviewing some of the documents you've created, providing you with some support or expertise. The hospitals are a great resource, of course, as well as any healthcare provider that you already contract with provide healthcare services to your employees. Of course, don't forget the students, if they're able to be involved, or any organizations that might send students to your facility, if that's them. So those are all awesome opportunities to do. 3 bits of advice: start small, focus on one thing, and let it blossom from there. And the last thing is to just take that little bit of a win that you can have and build on it so you can grow it slowly. Don't try and accomplish too much at one time when you're trying to reach out to the community.
Great advice. And I think the only thing I would like to add is that people really do have a strong desire to be helpful. So asking is sometimes the biggest hurdle.
What's the worst thing they can do is say, no, they can't help you, and then you just move on to the next person. So good luck with that activity. And it's really important to get that support. People are more than willing to support you when you're looking for resources.
Maybe still.
Yeah, you never know.
There are so many resources available with this video. Some of the key resources that we've mentioned throughout are the USDA Summary of the Final Wellness Policy Rule, the Alliance for Healthier Generation Model Wellness Policy, the Smarter Lunchrooms Scorecard and website, and the Maryland Nutrition Standards for all foods sold in schools. So what are your next steps? Examine your current wellness policy. Look at your goals. Identify if they're measurable. Where did they come from? Are they from evidence-based best practices? What's missing that's required by the final rule? Start writing your policy. You've done enough research and you've watched enough videos. Write, revise, revise. Engage key stakeholders, and when you have a final draft of your policy, send it to leah.jaspers@maryland.gov. Don't forget to watch webinar number 3, Communicating and Promoting Your Wellness Policy.
Please listen carefully.
Still have questions? Call me at 410-767-0212.